Let's move to chapter number 5 of India, that is Bharat, which is decoloniality, indigeneity, subjectivity, and relationality. Now, herein, the author makes a distinction between decolonial and post colonial schools of thought, as he has also done in the first chapter, I believe. Now, he starts by telling us that the most important right for any society or any country or any territory or any nation state or any state of individuals is the right of self determination. That is to make their own decisions without any interference from any outside authority. Now, the decolonial school focuses on these diverse subjectivities which these individuals should have while exercising the right of self determination, as opposed to the post colonial school of thought, which prioritizes the European worldview and the European distinguishing mechanisms for the set of authorities. For example, the idea of secularism or the idea of the forms of government, separation of power, and so on and so forth. So, in essence, what it means is that the post colonial school of thought does not empower indigeneity and does not empower the indigenous thought process and the subjectivities attached to it. Now, what needs to be done, which is there in the decolonial school of thought, is the relocation of geography and biography of knowledge to the native people, as opposed to making sure that the reins still are there with the European colonizers, even though they are not now directly controlling it, but indirectly controlling it through their thought processes. The decolonial school focuses on the subjective experience of each society, where they can exercise this freely according to their own lived experiences. Now, herein, the author makes a distinction by telling us that he is not saying that you should completely disregard all of the European ideas, and you should not say that all of them are bad, because some of them might have been accultured by the European societies and they might have been taken from the native societies only. But at the very least, there is a need to create a dialogue between the native societies as well as the colonizers and their ideas, so that a middle path can be created. Now, from a practical standpoint, the author gives us two things that can happen and that needs to happen. Firstly, there can be a complete overhaul of all of the structures that have been left by the European colonizers, and we can go back to the native societies' way of life or their thought processes or their uh, creations of mechanisms which can be used to make the country function. Or a more practical idea can be retaining the skeletal structure but using the indigenous ideas to reform these skeletal structures and make them more workable for the indigenous societies. Which brings us to the next subsection, which is the decolonial evolution from indigenous people to indigeneity. Now, two international conventions of International Labour Organization have been talked about, of 1957 and 1989. Herein, indigenous people are distinguished from dominant national communities. Now, this might seem like a good definition for countries like America, New Zealand, Australia, where the native communities or the indigenous people have been reduced to the minorities, and hence the majority communities which are there are European in nature or are the whites. They are the dominant national communities. Hence, this distinctions becomes important there to protect the indigenous people. But this artificial distinction is not right for countries with dominant national communities which are comprising of the indigenous people only. For example, like India or Bharat. What this leads to is the creation of a permanent fault line or a divide, where the national communities in Bharat are treated as the same as European colonizers, as they have inherited their legacy and now they are going to somehow mistreat the indigenous people. Now, this creates a fault line and creates a sort of divide between the two communities, which is not the reality. All of them have had the same lived experiences. And because of these conventions and other such issues, there is an internationalization of the issue, wherein the Europe can again interfere in the domestic affairs of these countries to act as a moral authority to guide them and again interfere on their independence. And even this internationalization of this issue does not talk about the conversion attempt, that is the forced conversion in the name of civilization that happens to these native people or to the indigenous people or to the tribal. It is worth noting that all of the indigenous societies, the development aid that was given to them, it was also contingent on reshaping them according to the lines that the Europeans wanted, the European people wanted. It was not contingent on them having their own structures or their own thought processes. So this development aid was also contingent, which is also which also strengthens the fact that development itself, the idea was a Western idea, which was very opposed to how the indigenous societies and the natives used to live in harmony with their nature and environment. Which brings us to the next subsection, which is the relational land ontology of indigeneity. Now, the views on nature between the colonizers and the colonized was very different. The Europeans viewed nature as means to an end, whereas the natives or the indigenous people viewed nature as a part of it in a relational basis, in a reciprocal basis, a give and take relationship where they are in a symbiotic relation with nature and they take from nature and they give back to it. The colonizers viewed nature as territorial jurisdiction, that is their property, they can use it and exploit it as they want. Whereas the natives viewed it in a spiritual basis, spiritual not in a mystical sense, but in terms of a respectful emotional sense, which they have taken from their ancestors and which they must respect and keep the sanctity of it in the most purest sense. Which brings us to the final part of this particular chapter and also the first section of this book, which is what are the goals of decoloniality, because we have been talking about it since more than 130 or 40 pages. The goals of decoloniality, according to the author, are firstly creation of a space for indigenous ideas to breathe and create a dialogue in the free society in the name of globalization. These indigenous ideas need to create a dialogue between other thought processes so that the best alternative for each society can be find out rather than forcing the European worldview on them. Second is because now the development which has happened in the previous few years, we have seen the negative impacts that it has caused to the nature. Perhaps the relational association with nature as the natives or the indigenous people used to live can again be reclaimed, and the indigenous knowledge systems can be used to live in a more harmonious way with nature, so that the nature which we have destroyed since so many years, it can again be strengthened and respected. And third, the idea of discarding of white man's burden needs to happen, that even without the structures left behind by the European people or the white men, still the indigenous societies have their own structure, have their own thought processes which they can lead to make their country or their living places a beautiful place. They do not need the European people's viewpoints or their worldview. They can have their own subjective experiences and they can create their own realities according to their own ways of life, which they have strengthened from multiple millennia. It is worth noting here that the European Dark Ages, which were there before 500 years in Europe, was not the case in other countries or other places. The other countries were much more prosperous than Europe, and they had a way of life even before European countries alive. So there is no need for this white man's burden. With that, we come to the end of chapter 5.